thank you for the opportunity to join you this evening. And I want to thank Dave as well as Rex Hall for their hospitality over the weekend. We just came over from Coventry, and for the pleasant time that we've enjoyed over here. And this is going to be my last day. We're headed back home tomorrow, but I think we'll be here again. And I've visited the United Kingdom on a number of occasions, sometimes with my wife, as a matter of fact. So I regret she couldn't come this time. She's busy getting ready for Thanksgiving and all the family coming in. And next time I hope that she can come, we can make more of a vacation of it. But I do have a wife, and we were married 47 years ago. And we have 4 children, just for a little personal background. And my wife has been my strongest supporter. I couldn't have done anything like this without her, because she's the one who has been there when I wasn't, for raising kids and doing lots of other things, and the one who has to sit on the sidelines and watch. And she's the one that really took the risk. I was doing what I like to do, as all the astronauts do, and we're willing to accept the risk. We sign up for that. But as you get closer to launch day, over a period of 2 years or so, you know, the moment of truth is coming, and so the risk gets greater and greater and more felt by the families than ever before. So they're the ones who have probably the most misgivings, and they have most to lose, as well as those who contribute the most. So I wish she were here. She's got all the best stories anyway. She has a kind of a speaking life of her own, but she's been raising these kids. And we have 3 married families now. All of them live in Texas. You will wonder why. That's where they were raised. But we have one young fella who is still near home. He's going to college, and one of these days I suppose that Grandma's thinking about getting into Texas more often, more frequently, see all her 7 grandchildren. So that's a little on the personal note, and I want to thank you once again for the chance to be here. What I propose to do this evening is to talk about the space shuttle mission that I flew, because I know that you have heard a lot about Skylab from Paul Weitz and perhaps other astronauts, but I'm grateful for the press that Dave and others give to the Skylab, because it was kind of the poor kid brother of the Apollo program. And we're a little sensitive to that, but not much. We were training to go to the moon, and all of a sudden we were so successful so soon that NASA decided that they'd cut their losses and reduce their risks and go into something else, and had all the rocks, I guess, they needed. So they decided to do other things and use the equipment that was left over from the Apollo program for this these space station flights. Nobody had ever stayed in space very long except the Russians. They were there for 23 days, 18 before that I believe, but 23 days, and they had a tragic return. And as we were training for the Skylab missions, we wondered, well, why did this happen? Was it because they had some special, some space malady, having been there that long, and is that all it takes in space is 23 days? And or was it an accident? Well, those were the days before the Iron Curtain was lifted, the days of the Cold War. We weren't sure we'd get the answer, but they were real good about coming back and saying, no, the problem was mechanical, and it had nothing to do with space illness. So we felt free to continue in the preparation for the Skylab missions, and went on to fly them. But you know, the Apollo missions and the Gemini and the Mercury missions were very operationally oriented. This is how we learned to fly in space. And the lunar mission was simply a succession of events that had to occur accurately and precisely and on time in order to complete the mission and get home. But there was not much done about whether you could really live in space a long time and do useful work, do science in space, or resource management, and all those other things that people had dreamed of. And so this is what the Skylab missions really proved. We proved that we could live and work in a weightless environment for a longer period of time without having to have artificial gravity, rotating space stations, and all those sorts of things. And we could study the sun and study the earth and study the medical aspects of being in space, and do high school student experiments, do technology experiments, and really feel just as good up there as we did on the ground after we'd been there for a few days, and to be productive. And we perfected the zero gravity spacewalking, which we were very poor at going through the Gemini program. And of course, We had spacewalks on the moon, but gravity helps you there, and zero gravity spacewalks are much more difficult. And we trained for them, we planned for them, and we developed those techniques before we left. And it turns out that we were able then to demonstrate that we could do zero gravity spacewalks very successfully by just using and often just the tools that you have in your own garage. We don't have to have a lot of special space tools, reactionist tools and all that. We could just get a set of wrenches and screwdrivers and pliers and go to work just like you do at home when you're doing your own plumbing or electrical work. And so the Skylab missions really demonstrated that you could live and work in space and be productive and do successful things in zero gravity. So we moved on into the shuttle program, and the Skylab's still up there going around, and it's coming down faster than we had thought it might. We didn't know much about what was out there or how much of it there was and why it would cause a spacecraft to come down. We just thought there was not much of anything out there that would make that happen, but we noticed that the Skylab wasn't at 275 miles anymore. It was coming down to 270, 235, and it was getting lower, and it was coming down much sooner than we had expected. So we're going to have to do something with it. And the question was what? And it turns out that we found out that it was related to the solar activity. The more solar activity there was, the more particles coming from the sun, from flares and prominences and all those things that happen on the sun. It caused our atmosphere to expand and to swell and make it more dense at those altitudes the Skylab was flying. And then there was more drag on it, and it came down faster when there was more solar activity. And we plotted that every day, the amount of solar activity versus the altitude of the Skylab. And so when the first 4 shuttle crews were assigned, the third flight was a Skylab reboost mission. And I was assigned to that. And so we set about to make a booster package about the size of a truck that we would put in the back of the space shuttle. And when we rendezvoused with the Skylab, we would station keep about 1,000 feet away. And my job was to with a television set and with hand controllers, pop this booster package out of the back of the space shuttle and fly it remotely over and dock it onto the Skylab, where we docked the command module. It had this docking package had a docking probe just like the command module had. It had a television camera to see where it was going so we get lined up properly, a little attitude control thrusters to control its attitude, and a big booster engine on it to either boost the Skylab higher, where it'd be safer, or to a known place in the water without hitting anybody, because we became very concerned about the Skylab coming down in a populated area. So nobody ever decided which of those we were going to do, because the Skylab didn't know anything about the shuttle schedule. And it kept slipping further downstream, and so we got moved from the third flight to the second flight, and pretty soon it became certain that we would never ever make it with the first flight, let alone the second. So the whole mission was canceled after we worked on it for a whole year. And the Skylab, as you know, came in with the help of Mission Control. It had no deboosting package on it at all, but they noticed that if they flew it like this, into the wind, so to speak, it didn't come down as fast, but when they turned it around sideways, then it would come down more or faster, lose altitude more quickly. And of course the Skylab, nobody had ever intended to do this with it. It was a derelict up there. After we finished with it, we had done everything with it that was necessary. And it drifted around there for several years and nobody ever talked to it or looked at it. And it was a remarkable achievement for the ground to be able to actually contact it, and not only contact it, but give it directions and show it what to do. And so they were able to project it way, way ahead several orbits with this changing its orientation to the wind, so to speak, and cause more and less drag and get it, most of it, to go land in the Indian Ocean. A few Australian farmers had picked up a few pieces on the land and became famous, and also wanted to become rich with that. And maybe they did, I don't know. But that's how the third Skylab, or the third shuttle mission started out. So when that mission was no longer there, I moved back from the second mission to the third mission. And we took on other assignments to test the space shuttle. The first 4 flights of the space shuttle were test missions. They were flown with only 2 people in order to reduce the risk. And the idea was that if these 4 test missions were flown successfully, then the shuttle would be declared operational, and we put more people in it and fly it more often. And so that, in fact, did occur. And we were testing the space shuttle much like we might test a high-performance airplane out in the desert somewhere, put it through its paces, fly it out to the edge of its design envelope, and see if it would fly around the edges of that where it was designed, so that the taxpayers were getting what they paid for. And so this is what we were doing. We were also testing this arm the Canadians made to take things out of space and put them in the cargo bay and vice versa. This was only the 2nd flight of the arm that I flew on, and the first time was something massive on the end of it. You know, of course, the arm has been used to put the Hubble Space Telescope and other large packages out there, or to go and rendezvous with them and hold them in place while astronauts worked out and repaired them. So something that weighs maybe 30, 40, 50,000 pounds, as big as a school bus. But in those days, we were just trying something a little more massive on the end of the arm to see how it would react and perform with that there. And also, at the same time, inside of that massive thing we had on the end of it wasn't very big, but it was big for the arm at the time. There were sensors in there to measure the environment around the space shuttle to see if it was going to be a good scientific platform. So we had about 6 or 8 sensors, as I recall, on this package that we were moving with the arm to measure the constituents of this cloud of particles that we were dragging along with us. The shuttle was outgassing from its materials into the vacuum of space, and we'd drag those particles along. Or to measure the interference of the very thin plasma through which we were flying, or the electrical charge or capacitance on the vehicle, or the electromagnetic interference when we used the radios and so forth. And so on 4 different days, for half a day each day, we would get this arm out, pick up this package, and wave it around, move it around the space shuttle in different places, flying the arm either automatically or manually, and making these measurements out in front of the space shuttle and out behind it and so forth, but at the same time checking out the arm. And it turns out the arm worked perfectly. It almost always has, and the shuttle turns out to be a very clean scientific platform. We learned that. Besides all of this, we were doing 15 scientific experiments. Some of them were in the cargo bay, and some of them were in the cabin. And we had to attend them, do them, watch them, turn them on, turn them off, take the data and so forth. So we were pretty busy 2 fellows there for 7 days. And that was the duration of the mission. It was planned to be 7 days. At this time, we were also just landing on lake beds. You know, we weren't landing on hard surface runways like you have out here at your international airport. We were not quite sure if the guidance system would direct us back properly to the runway, and whether we would be at the right place at the right time. Because, you know, the shuttle's a glider. It's not an airplane like you have out here, where if you have another plane on the runway, or the weather isn't good, or you don't like the approach, you just pour the coal to it, go around, try it again. The shuttle's going to land, and you want to be at the right place at the right time, or you better look for a freeway or something else, because it's coming down. So we weren't dead sure that the guidance system was going to do all that. And on a lake bed in Edwards Air Force Base, as a matter of fact, you can scrape out a runway on that lake bed. It's in the summertime, it's hard packed like concrete, and you can scrape it nice and smooth and make a runway that's 5, 6, 7 miles long. And as a matter of fact, you can make several of them crisscross. So you have a lot of options when you come back there if things aren't going right. But it turns out that about a week before we were to go, it was raining in California, and the lake bed was not a dry lake bed, it was wet, it was a lake. And so we couldn't land there, and we really didn't want to land in the hard surface runway at Cape Canaveral, so Chris Kraft came to me, and we were in quarantine before this mission for about 3 weeks. That meant that we had to camp out in some trailers on the compound at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and live there and go to our simulators, but live on the base. We couldn't go be with our families because the kids transmit all kinds of bugs, you know, and they didn't want us to get sick while we were up there, and that was their purpose for it. And the people that worked with us had to be certified healthy every day when they came, and they had to wear these masks, like surgical masks. So it was kind of inconvenient, but it was a good thing and it worked. But he came out to the trailer about a week before we were going to fly down to the Cape and get ready to get into the shuttle, and said, you know, we can't land at the lake bed. We don't want to land on the hard surface at the Cape. What would you think about landing at the White Sands Missile Range? That's in southeastern New Mexico, just north of El Paso, Texas. And it's a smaller lake bed, only has a couple runways on it, some mountains around there. And so it's one of those places you want to be a little careful if you don't if you don't know exactly where you're going to come down. So I said, well, Chris, you know, the navigation isn't so good out there, and there aren't very many runway options, and the ones we have aren't as long as they are at Edwards. So if the weather's decent, that's just fine, because we had been practicing out there with our shuttle training airplanes and so forth. That was White Sands was one of the places we practiced, besides at the Cape and also at Edwards. And so I said, well, if we have good weather, why, it'll be all right. He said, well, I can't guarantee the weather, you know that. But I said, let's go do it. And so they moved 38 train car loads of stuff from Edwards Air Force Base to the White Sands at that point, and worked on that while we were gone. And 2 weeks later, when we landed, while it was all set up and ready to go, and we landed at the White Sands Missile Range. So a funny story with that was that my wife was there with our 3 oldest children, waiting for us to come back, and lots of other people were there too. She had some guests, and everybody had their friends, and whoever wanted to come came across the country. So there's several thousand people waiting for us to come back. So we got all ready to come back on the 7th day, and we got our suits on and got strapped in our seats and got all of the doors closed and everything battened the hatches, you know, so it wouldn't be floating around when we were coming in. And they said, okay, 30 minutes before we were going to fire the engine, we got all turned around to slow down. When you come back to the atmosphere, you have to realize we're 200 miles above the Earth now, and the top of the atmosphere is 70 miles. So we've got 130 miles to fall through space until we hit the edge of the atmosphere. But the only way to do it is to slow down. You don't want to slow down too much, because you come in so steep that you'll overstress the airplane or burn up. You don't want to come in too shallow, because you will kind of skip and you won't quite slow down enough to land where you want to land. So you have to do it just right and fly through this this corridor on one side where you either come apart structurally, or if you're a little too shallow, then you're coming in too slow and you have too much heat pulse and you'll burn up. So the envelope is quite narrow. And so we were already turned around and ready to slow down, and they said 30 minutes before that, they said, don't wait, stop. You're going to have to stay for an extra day. We had a bad windstorm at the landing site, and the lake bed there is made of gypsum, very fine powdery stuff, and so it was whipping up and blowing so that we would not be able to see the runway. And we had a check airplane out there trying to make approaches with John Young, my boss, as a matter of fact, flying it, and he said, we're calling it off today, we're not going to bring them in. So they said, you can't come in today, and so we had an extra day in our world's favorite vacation spot, but they said, you're going to have to come tomorrow, and either to White Sands, or we're going to have the first shot at the landing on the 15,000-foot runway at the Cape. Seems like a long runway, it's 300 feet wide, but you know, I'd rather they had split it down the middle and made it half as wide and twice as long, but they didn't. So the next day we were able to come down. They said it's clear weather. We had a dry run on this the day before. We came to the end of our flight plan that day. There was a flight plan about that thick, and there was no 8th day. So we finally had a chance to look out the window after doing all these busy things. We might as well have been in Toledo for all we were able to see of what we were doing. But we finally came down and landed at White Sands. But before we did, there was a question as to where we were going to land. And so my wife, being there with her kids and all her friends and relatives and so forth, NASA asked my wife, they said, where do you want to watch the landing tomorrow, here at White Sands or at Cape Canaveral? She says, where's it going to land? You know, obvious question. Well, he said, we don't know where it's going to land. We just can't tell, because if the weather's bad tomorrow, it's going to be at the Cape. And if you're going to go, you need to get on the airplane that's going there right now, because it's taking a bunch of people there, and you won't get to go there unless you get on that airplane. So she went back to her quarters and got the kids ready to leave. And as she was going back to the quarters, she came across a gardener, was out there in front of the military barracks, and he was hoeing in the shrubbery and so forth. And it was clear he'd lived there a long time. Old Mexican fellow who was, rather wise and dried face and so forth, but doing his work. And so he asked her, or she asked him. She said, "Sir, could you tell me what the weather's going to be here tomorrow?" Do you ever hear this story? Good. And he said, "Well, ma'am, I've lived here all my life, and it's never blown like this 2 days in a row. Never blows this hard 2 days in a row." So my wife goes back and she tells NASA, "I'm going to stay here. I'm not going to get on the airplane. I'm going to watch the landing here tomorrow." NASA, didn't know what to think. They didn't know, with all their meteorology, all their satellites, all their technology, everything they knew about the weather, they couldn't tell her what the gardener told her. So she stayed there, and sure enough, we landed there the next day. But it goes to show you, you can't always depend on this. Sometimes you have to use common sense. You can't use this technology all the time. The space shuttles had a problem. That Columbia is the one that crashed on February 1st. And we can talk about that later if you really want to. There was this very detailed inquiry as to what caused the accident, and we believe that the findings of the accident board were right on target. They made some required fixes that have to be made, and NASA's in the process of making them. And it will take quite a long time, probably longer than everybody expects. Right now they're planning to fly again sometime around next September, but that's just for planning purposes. Most of us think it's going to take longer than that, but they'll have to figure out ways to inspect themselves, either from the space station or with some other device if they're not near a space station, and to make any repairs that are necessary, which could be made at the space station, or if they're not in that space station's orbit, to be able to make them independently, which is another level of difficulty. So I'm confident that most of the flights in the near future, or the early flights of the space shuttle, will be at daylight. They've rigged up some very much more sensitive ground cameras to track the space shuttle so they can see what happens more clearly than they were able to on this flight. They will fly only in the daytime for that purpose for quite some time. They'll only fly in the same orbit as the space station so that they can go to it if they need to. They always will fly with a docking apparatus so they can dock with the space station, so their flight profiles are going to be limited for some time until they're able to inspect and fix themselves in independent orbits. So that's the direction it's going. But what I like to talk a little bit about now is what most people ask about, and that is, what is it like to be in space? Being in space is going to be unique whenever anybody goes, and I hope more people get to go in the future than we think. But it's going to be continue to always to be unique to be up there and look back at the Earth, see it in a new and different way, and get a new and different appreciation for the world in which we live and the Earth on which we're inhabiting. Perhaps you recall when the Apollo astronauts went to the moon. They came back, and here these lucky guys got to go to the moon, and people asked them, what was it like to be on the moon? What was it like to be in space? And they said, wow, it was unbelievable. It was just absolutely amazing. It was fabulous, just a marvelous experience. And all those words that don't convey anything to anybody. And I thought, why can't these so-called intelligent people convey what they've just had an opportunity to observe in a better way? And I thought, well, maybe it's just because they're engineers and can't express themselves very well. But I'm an engineer, so I can say that. But I think more it's because there just aren't really good words to express it. I thought, well, when I go on the Skylab mission, it's going to be 2 months, and I'm sure going to have a chance to learn how to answer that question properly, because the people who ask it have a right to know and have a need to know and should be told. After all, they're paying the bill in most cases. And so I thought, well, I'll savor the experience and I'll answer that question. I got back to one of the first questions I was asked, and I wasn't ready for it, and I was really frustrated and disappointed in myself. And I wondered, why was this that I couldn't, why was this that I couldn't answer that question? And I decided that there's a great disparity between what's real in space and what isn't. Whereas on the ground there are some unreal things. They're not so widely separated from the real things of life. But in space it's totally different. The black sky. The sky is always black in space. There's no blue sky like we have. We're used to looking up and, well, we saw a blue sky this morning and seeing the blue sky, and to have a black sky is just so unusual. But that's all you see after you get above 70 miles is a black sky. In the day, the sun burns a hole in that black sky. You can't see any stars, but it beautifully illuminates the Earth and reflects off the spacecraft. And at night, you can see 5 or 6 times as many stars as you can see on the highest mountain in the world on a clear day. You're lost in a sea of stars, and you have certain navigational stars that you use to recover your attitude or your knowledge of your position in space if you have to. And you have those picked out, but you can't find them in the sea of stars anymore. And you have to be in orbit for a couple of 2 or 3 night passes and look for those stars before your brain starts to filter out all those other objects out there and find the navigation stars you're looking for. And on the ground, you see fires on the ground at night, of course, where they're burning off oil plumes. You're up at 200 or 300 miles, you can see all that with the naked eye. Or where there's a forest fire, they're burning the sugar cane. You see the lights of cities on the ground. See the outlines of the coastlines where it's lighted. And you can see maybe 3 or 4 or 5 different weather systems. You know, one comes over with lightning in it, lots of lightning activity. You don't see one of them up there. You see several of them, maybe 4 or 5, but different directions and miles apart, hundreds of miles apart, just popping off like Chinese firecrackers. And it's one of the unrealities of being in space is to see all those kinds of things at night you can't see from here, as well as to have that black sky in the daytime. Another unreality, of course, is when you have your nose pressed up against this window or right outside your space helmet on a spacewalk. There's no air out there. And you realize that you're in a hostile environment, you're living in a hostile environment, and you have to be extremely careful with the air. You know, down here we take the air that we breathe for granted, and up there we take it with us, and you don't want to lose any of it. So you have to be conscious of the fact that you're in this hostile environment with respect to the air that you breathe. Another unreality is the sunrise and the sunset. They're not all that more beautiful in space. They're different. A little sliver of light on the horizon when the sun comes up, and it grows like a sickle there are the varying levels, colors of the rainbow as it widens, and all of a sudden it comes up like an explosion on the horizon and it's light. And when it goes down at night, it goes down like you're turning out the lights in a room. There's very little twilight at that great speed over the Earth. There's just there's very little twilight, so you're in it or you're out. I remember being out and doing a spacewalk and being out on the end of the space station and replacing the film in one of the solar telescopes. I was just hanging on by one foot and doing my work, and we went into the darkness and they didn't turn on the lights in the spacecraft, and we were over Siberia or somewhere. There wasn't much light on the ground and there was no moon, just the stars above, and I almost couldn't see the hand in front of my face, but I was hanging on by one foot, whirling around the world at 17,500 miles an hour, and that's a unique way to live, you know. And it's one of the reasons you go to do it, and it was a fabulous experience. But when the sunrise and sunset happens, it's very quick, is the point. But more to the point is the unreality is that you have 16 of them every day, 16 sunrises and sunsets every hour and a half, because you go around, you spend about 60 minutes of that hour and a half in the light of the sun, but then you get in the shadow of the Earth and it's dark. So it's sunrise, sunset, and that's an unreal way to live as well. Another unreality, of course, is the weightlessness. You saw what it's like to be weightless. It's a very pleasant, relaxing, comfortable feeling. You go to sleep right here in the middle of the room if you want to, or glide up and change the light bulb with no ladder and put your friend or your enemy right in prison in this space. Just let go with no motion, and that person can do flips and tumbles around the center of gravity as much as they want to, but they can't swim, they can't move, they're just imprisoned in this big open room. So there's lots of things that are weightless that are nifty to do, and they are unreal things, but because you can't do them here on Earth. I think the most unreal part, though, is the view of the Earth. at 200 or 300 miles, you know, the Earth doesn't look a little like that is when you're at the moon. It actually, if you do a spacewalk, it's about, oh, it's about this big. Look all around. I'm glad none of you believes in the Flat Earth Society, because the world is round. And I know you wouldn't do a thing like that with a British Interplanetary Society. But to see the Earth is such a magnificent spectacle that you never get tired of looking at it. We never had enough time to look at the Earth. We always had our nose up against the window if we had any free time. But when you're out doing a spacewalk, rather than being inside and just seeing part of this Earth going by like a two-dimensional perspective as you might have in a car or in a train car, when you go outside, you're dazzled by the brilliance of the sunlight, and you have this great three-dimensional perspective now that makes you sense the speed over the ground. And you can just feel yourself going faster than you can when you're inside. And you have this great perspective that enables you to see everywhere. And I remember being over Chicago, and I could see Washington, Baltimore, and Denver, and New Orleans, and to the halfway up Hudson Bay, and just have this huge, huge view. But with the naked eye, you can still see freeways and cities and airports and the river systems and the shorelines and so forth, and it's just so beautiful. And you're gliding along at this great speed, but there's nothing flopping in the breeze. There's no sound. There's no motion. It's just like gliding along on a magic carpet into the sunset and into the sunrise, into the sunset, into the sunrise. And Mission Control is wondering how you're doing up there. If you're getting your job done, you say no. And we got a lot more to do. We got a lot more to do, and all those things you thought we did, we haven't got them done yet. And you do everything you can to stay out there as long as you possibly can. And spacewalking is the, no pun intended, the high point of being in orbit. The launch gets your attention, and so does the reentry. But being in orbit, every day is the same except those that are separated out to do spacewalks. And as you're gliding along like that, you can see all the beautiful colors. You can see the blues of the ocean and the white of the clouds and the snow on the mountains and the green and brown patchwork of the farmers' fields and the beautifully painted deserts, painted just the way the master painter painted them so many years ago, and all their living hues of browns and reds and purples. And they're so much more vivid now because you can see the great contrast of color from up there that you can't see when you're down below. And the world looks like a map. Perhaps you have a globe here at the BIS, or you have one at home. The kids have them in school. And you realize instantly that the one thing that you can't see on that globe below that you see at the one at home are those boundaries that separate the countries. You can't see those black and red lines that separate people from each other that weren't placed there when the world was created, but are placed there by people in their inability to get along with their neighbor. Man's inhumanity of man has caused all the differences in languages and cultures and in ways we live and lack of communication and so forth. And you have this ideal feeling, and I know we live in a real world, but I think we ought to seek that which is ideal. And it would be ideal if we could live together sociologically, politically, and all those other ways without those boundaries, much the way that you see the world physically from space without those boundaries. So there are a number of perspectives that we have now that we've been able to go into space that we never had by just looking at the pictures. Because now we have people up there with all kinds of different experiences, with cognitive thought processes and capabilities, with eyes and abilities to take what they see and combine it with things they know, and to come up with new perspectives. And so there are a number of them I guess we could talk about. I maybe mention just a couple more. One, of course, is that we're actually living on a spacecraft. The Earth is a spacecraft, and we're all astronauts upon it because it's hurtling through space at tremendous speeds. We just don't realize it. And you know, on a spacecraft, there's no grocery stores or gas stations up there. You have to learn to conserve your supplies. You have to take good care of this place because you want to use it for a long time, or maybe somebody else is going to use it after you. Same way on spacecraft Earth, we're going to have to learn how to find new resources and how to use the ones that we have more effectively and more efficiently, and be better housekeepers of a spacecraft Earth if it's going to have a successful mission in the future. But most especially, and the crews all have to get along with each other. All the astronauts, if there were any kind of personal animosities, they were all put aside in order to depend on each other for safety and for success. Everyone depends on the other, and personal disagreements are just disappear. Same way on spacecraft Earth. We're going to have to get along better with our other colleagues on the Earth than we have in the past if we're going to have a safe and successful mission, or if our kids and their kids are going to have as good a time that we've had here. The final perspective is another one of these disparities, and that is that there's this great disparity between the technology we have today to live on the Earth and how we live on the Earth as people. Because the space shuttle is one of the most advanced inventions that's ever been created by human minds and put together with human hands. But every time we go around the world, we're crossing over a place or maybe over 15 wars, every orbit, every hour and a half, 15 wars. So some we hear about in the news every day, and others are just seething beneath the surface waiting to erupt. But still, these are places where people are killing each other for the same old reasons, just with different weapons. And there's this disparity between the technology we have and the way we live on Earth. Every hour and a half we're going over places where people have never had enough to eat, where they've never had proper medical attention. And we see this great disparity as it grows, and we wish we could use this technology to make the world a better place for everyone to live, but perhaps we can, but there's more to it than that. You know it and I know it, that it really matters as to how much we care, how much concern we have, how much we're willing to share our lives and quality of life with other people, and how much we take our quality of life for granted and complain about the smallest things that other people would never ever think about. And somehow we're going to not only have to use this technology and other tools that we have to make it a better place to live, but we're going to have to develop an attitude where we realize that it's going to take individual and personal responsibility and action and decisions to go and help these people in some way. So my hat's off to the people that do, to the medical doctors, to the resource managers, people who help with health and hygiene, missionaries, and others who are trying to bring some of our civilization and perhaps some of our technology and some of the other ways that we have of doing things to these peoples, so that there will be less of a disparity between the way we live on Earth and the technology we have to do it, and less and more peace and ability to get along with one another because of it. So I share these ideas with you, these perspectives with you, with the hope that perhaps they will ring true with you and challenge you to challenge our kids to go on and do the things that we haven't been able to do, and perhaps to do the things that we should be doing better. So these are some of the perspectives from space, and this is what it's like to be there, and I hope that this has conveyed to you some of what that's like. Thank you very much.